On the morning the filters were changed, a decorated commissar pinned a valor medal to a civilian's rebreather. The disc of stamped brass clinked softly against composite, then lay flat over the mouth grill like a saint's coin on a corpse's eyes. The man inside the mask tried to smile, and the visor fogged. His thanks came as a filtered hiss, swallowed by the siren that signaled the first containment doors sliding shut. Scribes noted the time, the unit, the dosage. A priest intoned the litany of remedies into a microphone that fed the hive's public address. The ceremony ended with the hiss of seals and the sound of heavy locks engaging. In the Imperium, gratitude is measured, sterilization is scheduled, and mercy has paperwork. Imperial heroism is violence rendered procedural, scalable, and sanctified by audit. The iconography promises salvation, the ledgers demand completion. In a society that sustains itself by grinding fear into fuel, good intentions are not a defense, they are raw material. The machine teaches you to turn a face into a figure. The figure goes into a threshold. The threshold tells you what must be done. 3 people entered the machine believing they would be different. Captain Thane took his oath in the chapel of a strike cruiser, the ship's bones vibrating with the distant labor of the reactors. He placed a gauntleted hand upon a reliquary of a long-dead chapter master and vowed to spend his strength so others might keep their children and their food. Behind the altar, a mural showed a winged Astartes stepping through fire with civilians in tow. The inscription beneath named him only by epithet, the Ash Angel. Thane's eyes lingered there. He had been taught the legend as proof that an uncompromising blade could still be a shield. Commissar Vex stood in the Schola Progenium's drill hall for his graduation inspection, boots aligned with a painted line that would be scrubbed again at dawn. He had learned that fear spreads like mold in a damp dormitory, that a clean cut now prevents rot later. He wore no medals yet, only the promise of them, threads waiting for metal. When the siren from the lower hive rolled up the ventilation shafts, he imagined himself the cure, visible, decisive, necessary. His instructors had given him a catechism of numbers and a pistol. He treasured both with a fervor teenagers reserve for first loves. Interrogator Caney was an acolyte then, not yet permitted to affix the rosette to his coat, but allowed to watch as it glinted on the desk of a superior. He sat among iron cabinets and ledgers in an archive where incense did nothing to mask the scent of old paper and solvent. Across the desk, a cogitator ticked in patient beats. He studied a table of variances projected in pale green, prayer attendance, production quotas, birth-death ratios, reports of unlicensed gatherings. A formula converted the tremors of daily life into risk. The line he circled, memorized, and did not yet understand read simply 2.3% variance threshold. Initiate corrective action. His mentor slid him a red-sealed packet without comment. Its title was masked, its doctrine clear in the weight of wax, contingency for when numbers demand more fire than words. The machine welcomed them with stories and small proofs. Every solved problem became an argument for stronger tools. Every tool came with a doctrine. The Carthage packet appeared again under different seals in different hands. Thane initialed that he had read and understood a contingency order, the text redacted in blocks but the signature line intact. Vex was briefed on sterilization protocols as strategic hygiene and told that while rare, decisive action prevented greater loss, Caney found that the red wax was rationed and issued only on days when transports full of refugees docked or plague rumors doubled. They all encountered the same sentence in different script. When containment cost threatens continuity, purge, to preserve. None of them said the words out loud. The phrase lived as a reflex, not a prayer. The legend of the Ash Angel threaded through their briefings and meals. Priests described him as the saint of hard arithmetic, the one who chose ash over rot. A data slate in Thane's quarters carried an anecdote about a world burned so 3 behind it might live. Truth was economical here. Icons carried more weight than footnotes. In the lower hive, the medal remained on the rebreather after the chamber filled with sweet-smelling nutrilant. A servitor met the family afterward with a clipboard and a voucher for low-smoke candles. The scribe skull linked the signature to a ledger and assigned the death to a column labeled, simply, Compliance. We begin here because transformation rarely announces itself as fall. It arrives as a checklist and a seal, a hero's mural above a rulebook, a variance rounding up to a purge. What turns these 3 from guardians into the system's most efficient killers? How does a sealed doctrine teach decent people to burn a hive and call it medicine? The machine that forges imperial heroes operates on a principle of calculated subtraction. Before it builds weapons, it strips away everything that makes a weapon hesitate. The scholar Progenium understands that empathy is inefficiency, that conscience compromises operational readiness. What the Imperium requires are instruments of policy, not people with preferences. The conditioning begins before recruits understand what they are losing, and it ends only when they can no longer remember what they have lost. Commissar Vex learned to kill people in a gymnasium where saints watched from painted walls. His instructors called it execution training, but the first lesson was simpler: how to stop seeing faces. The targets began as human silhouettes marked only with numbers and vital zones highlighted in red. Day 1, he missed. Day 7, he grouped shots through the heart. Day 14, he could place 3 rounds through a moving target's head while reciting the litany of duty. By month's end, the targets had faces again, but they were the faces of wavering guardsmen, panic-spreading civilians, officers removing helmets to vomit. The command cadence inverted compassion into policy. Double-tap the hesitant. Priority fire on morale breakers. Clean termination for the wounded who cannot advance. Mercy, when required, is terminal. The rebuilding followed the breaking with methodical precision. Recitation paired with recoil until prayer lived in the trigger finger. Vex excelled not through accuracy but through speed of decision. Instructors logged his scores as clearances per minute, assets preserved per engagement. He did not notice when his language changed, when people became vectors and squads became expendable resources. The scholar called this necessary cruelty, the inoculation that hurts to save the limb. Results eclipsed method in every evaluation. Commendations arrived phrased in abstractions, praising decisive action, while omitting that the scenario required shooting a trainee who simulated panic too convincingly. Interrogator Caney's practicum occupied chambers with no windows and soundproofed walls. His subjects were volunteers, his instructors explained, criminals seeking redemption through service to the throne. The curriculum was methodical. Week 1, psychological pressure through isolation and environmental control. Week 2, introduction of pain as information gathering methodology. Week 3, escalation protocols for uncooperative assets. Caney learned that truth was not binary but statistical, that under sufficient pressure everyone confessed to something useful. The art lay in determining which confessions were operationally valuable and which were merely the product of a broken mind seeking relief. His classroom was also a vault where the ordo calculus occupied half the chamber, cogitators humming, punch cards flitting through servo claws, lumen displays building probability matrices from raw intelligence. He learned to feed it prayer absence tallies, work stoppage reports, unsanctioned gathering frequencies, vox silence duration measurements. The machine converted the tremors of daily life into actionable thresholds. At 2.3% morale variance across 3 contiguous districts, initiate corrective action. Below that threshold, apply additional homilies and supplemental rations. Above it, prepare sterilization protocols, and requisition body disposal assets. Caney discovered he possessed an intuitive gift for reading the micro-expressions that preceded psychological collapse, for measuring screams against intelligence value. His instructors called it spiritual archaeology, the careful excavation of buried loyalties and hidden heresies. Captain Thane's conditioning was more profound, reaching beyond psychology into biology itself. As his body was rebuilt with gene seed and surgical augmentation, his mind was rewired through hypnoconditioning and neurochemical therapy. He lay beneath lumen strips while coils delivered controlled torment through the black carapace interfaces, each pulse teaching his nervous system to compartmentalize suffering as operational data. Pain became information. Endurance became proof of function. The screaming of civilians during orbital bombardment was reclassified as atmospheric disturbance that might interfere with Vox communications. When simulations presented panicked stampedes of HAB workers, the correct response was always to seal the bulkhead. After each exercise, instructors displayed outcome projections. Casualties with bulkhead sealed remained contained and manageable. Casualties with mercy gestures grew exponential and catastrophic. Acceptable loss mathematics made arguments that neither scripture nor sentiment could overcome. A battle brother phrased it as catechism. The blade does not ask the corridor whom it shelters, only what survives beyond it. Thane repeated the phrase until it sounded like natural law rather than chosen doctrine. This systematic conditioning operated under the unified doctrine of necessary cruelty, made sacred. Instructors across all institutions taught the same foundational principle. Violence in service of the Imperium was not violence at all, but surgery. The Imperium was a body under constant attack by ideological infection. Heresy was cancer, chaos was contagion. The heroes being forged were antibodies designed to identify and eliminate threats before they could metastasize. Their conditioning taught them to see themselves not as killers, but as healers wielding the scalpel of sanctioned force. The pain they inflicted was medicine. The deaths they caused were amputations that preserved the whole. The institutional logic rewarded results over methods with mathematical precision. Every operation required cost-benefit analysis. Every purge demanded statistical justification. Reports moved through command hierarchies as clean numbers. Time to compliance, deviation corrected, production quotas restored. No evaluation form asked whether children witnessed the executions. Commendations praised data clarity and operational efficiency while omitting the screams that produced both. The system had learned to measure everything that mattered and ignore everything that might cause hesitation. When conditioning was complete, Vex could execute a dozen men before morning meal and feel professional satisfaction. Caney could extract actionable intelligence from devoted pilgrims and file reports with clinical detachment. Thane could authorize the atmospheric sterilization of entire hive sectors and call it strategic necessity. They had become precisely calibrated instruments of imperial policy, weapons that never questioned their targeting parameters because they had been taught that questioning was the first symptom of corruption. The machine had succeeded in its fundamental purpose, creating heroes who would never recognize themselves as monsters because they measured their actions against thresholds rather than consequences, against doctrine rather than suffering. But weapons, once forged and sharpened, required testing in the field. How do these conditioned instruments perform when institutional doctrine encounters the chaotic reality of human desperation? What happens when the mathematics of loyalty demand not merely the difficult choice, but the choice that transforms the chooser into something unrecognizable? The conditioning held until reality tested it. Then training became reflex, doctrine became muscle memory, and abstract principles transformed into concrete actions measured in blood and silence. The machine had prepared its weapons well, but weapons require targets, and targets require decisions that no simulation could fully anticipate. Commissar Vex stood behind the firing line on Kerek Prime when the Orc artillery found its range. The barrage walked methodically across the trench network, each salvo closer than the last, until the eastern flank began to buckle under the psychological pressure. He watched through field glasses as individual guardsmen broke from their positions, then squads, then entire platoons streaming toward the secondary line in what tactical doctrine classified as tactical withdrawal, but which looked, through magnification, like contagion made manifest. The mathematics presented themselves with clinical clarity. His Vox bead crackled with variance readings, morale index dropping below acceptable thresholds, unit cohesion fragmenting, projected cascade failure across the entire defensive grid within minutes. The greater good equation resolved itself automatically. 47 men running would become 400, then 4,000. Panic spread faster than shrapnel. The line would collapse, the hive would fall, and reinforcements that could not be spared would be required from other fronts where they were desperately needed. Vex drew his bolt pistol and stepped into the service stairwell. The first retreating guardsman descended with mud-smeared visor reflecting the commissar's cap badge. 2 shots to center mass, 1 to the head, exactly as taught. The mass reactive rounds detonated inside the ribcage, spraying bone fragments across the men behind. The retreat stopped as if hitting a wall. Vex's voice carried over the artillery thunder, reciting execution protocols with parade ground precision. Return to positions or face summary execution for cowardice. No exceptions, no appeals. The Emperor does not sanction flight. 17 men died holding ground they might have abandoned. The line held. His after-action report noted successful application of morale correction techniques, deviation contained within acceptable parameters, ammunition expenditure minimal. The ledger recorded stability metrics and casualty ratios. It did not record the way the second runner sat down hard and wept into his gloves, or how the sound folded neatly into the compartment Vex had learned to label necessary. 3 systems away, Interrogator Caney established his field office in a mining colony where productivity had dropped below quota and sick leave requests had spiked beyond statistical norms. The Ordo calculus digested weeks of surveillance data and produced probability matrices. 4.7% variance in tithe compliance, unusual patterns of aftershift gatherings, prayer circles meeting without ecclesiarchy oversight. The behavioral profile matched 17 different seditious movements, from chaos cults to Tau ideological infiltration. Caney converted the colony's medical facility into an interview center, requisitioning treatment rooms for enhanced interrogation procedures. The first subjects were selected according to surveillance frequency rankings, individuals whose names appeared most often in intercepted communications. The techniques proved remarkably effective. Within hours, he extracted confessions of organized resistance, descriptions of mutual aid societies that bypassed official rationing systems, and names of additional conspirators who shared resources without authorization. The greater good equation made subsequent decisions automatic. Allowing coordinated resistance to imperial policy would encourage similar movements on other worlds. The Imperium's industrial capacity could not sustain widespread labor organization or unauthorized resource distribution. Better to eliminate the problem completely than risk ideological contagion spreading through the sector's mining operations. Caney authorized the detention and processing of 43 additional suspects, applying pressure until the colony's social networks collapsed into individual compliance. By week's end, productivity had returned to acceptable levels. The survivors worked longer shifts without complaint or collaboration. His report praised the successful identification and neutralization of seditious elements before they could mature into active rebellion, recommending similar preemptive measures for facilities showing comparable variance patterns. Captain Thane faced his test during a reactor containment failure on Hive Tertius, where cooling system collapse threatened to irradiate 17 levels of residential districts. Evacuation proceeded according to established protocols: essential personnel first, skilled workers second, general population by productivity rating. The contamination spread faster than atmospheric processes could contain it. Radiation readings indicated lethal exposure thresholds would be reached within hours. The transport capacity could accommodate perhaps 30% of the remaining population. The greater good equation offered its familiar calculus: attempt to save everyone and lose everyone to radiation poisoning, or preserve those who could be saved by containing the contamination at its source. Thane ordered blast doors sealed and atmospheric systems reversed to prevent spread to uncontaminated sectors. The screaming from the sealed sections lasted 47 minutes before radiation silenced it completely. 17,000 died in the lower levels. 300,000 survived in the upper reaches. His battle brothers questioned nothing. The mathematics were unassailable, the decision tactically sound. Thane's commendation praised his decisive action under extreme circumstances and recommended him for advancement to company command. The containment had worked exactly as designed. Each hero discovered the intoxicating clarity of utilitarian mathematics. Their conditioning had taught them to convert moral complexity into operational simplicity, human suffering into acceptable variables in equations that always resolved in favor of harsh necessity. Mercy was inefficiency, compassion was resource misallocation. Individual lives became data points in calculations measuring immediate cost against strategic benefit, personal tragedy against collective survival. The theoretical framework that sanctified these calculations arrived in red-sealed orders bearing the same weight of wax and inevitability. The Carthage Doctrine, its core text, brief and absolute. When containment cost threatened strategic continuity, sterilized to preserve. The doctrine cited precedent in its most celebrated practitioner, the legendary Ash Angel of Orthis Minor, who burned one world to preserve 3 supply lanes when xenospores contaminated atmospheric systems. His campaigns were taught in staff colleges as masterworks of strategic necessity, victory through subtraction, salvation through surgical amputation. The Ash Angel's image appeared on recruitment materials and chapel windows across the Imperium, a winged figure stepping through flame with the inscription he chose, Ash over Rot. Thane carried his lithograph in a breast pocket. Vex kept a prayer card scored by fingernail marks where the saint's boots met burning ground. Caney found the name in margin notes of tactical catechisms surrounded by numerical proofs of decisive action's effectiveness. This was the greater good equation as lived doctrine. Lives divided by outcomes, outcomes measured against continuity, continuity enthroned as the only mercy that mattered. Each man had performed his function and recorded results in proper forms. Each felt the small heat of professional satisfaction where doubt might have lived. The numbers validated their choices with mathematical certainty. First blood transformed policy into habit, doctrine into identity. The system had created heroes who measured success not in lives preserved but in objectives achieved, who felt righteous satisfaction in choices that would have horrified their former selves. They had proven themselves worthy instruments of imperial necessity, calibrated weapons that never questioned their targeting parameters. The ledgers registered stability and moved upward through command hierarchies, seeking signatures and commendations. But how does the Imperium reward these first compromises with human decency? What institutional mechanisms ensure that abnormal becomes normal, that exception becomes routine, that heroes learn to hunger for opportunities to prove their devotion through the mathematics of necessary cruelty. The ledgers from First Blood climbed upward through chains of command, transforming with each bureaucratic layer until brutality emerged as virtue. Numbers that began as casualty counts became commendations, torture sessions became efficiency ratings, and sealed blast doors became strategic victories. The Imperium's genius lies not in creating monsters, but in teaching them to see themselves as saints through a machinery of sanctification that operates on three interlocking principles: linguistic sterilization that converts atrocity into procedure, reward structures that make cruelty profitable, and social isolation that removes witnesses who might question the transformation. Commissar Vex received his commendation 3 weeks after Kerek Prime, the parchment heavy with seals from the Departamento Munitorum and counter-signatures from regimental command. The language praised his implementation of morale stabilization protocols and successful prevention of cascade failure across defensive positions. The document never used the word execution. Instead, it referenced personnel asset reallocation and operational efficiency metrics. 17 dead guardsmen became statistical variance correction, their blood transformed into data points measuring command effectiveness. The promotion to senior commissar arrived with expanded authority over multiple regiments and requisition privileges requiring minimal oversight. Interrogator Caney's mining colony operation earned him the full rosette of an interrogator, a small symbol of absolute authority personally affixed by his mentor. His reports praised exceptional aptitude for spiritual archaeology and innovative processing methods. The efficiency of his work, measured in rapid restoration of tithe quotas and cessation of unauthorized fraternization, made him a rising star within the Ordo Hereticus. His new assignment included access to sophisticated data engines and a cadre of dedicated acolytes eager to learn his enhanced interrogation techniques. Captain Thane's containment decision on Hive Tertius generated a rare commendation from his chapter master, citing unflinching dedication to the greater good. The 300,000 lives saved exponentially outweighed the 17,000 lost, the mathematics irrefutable within the chapter's strategic calculations. His reward came as temporary command of a full company, placing him at the vanguard of future containment operations where his decisive action could prevent larger catastrophes. The institutional mechanisms that normalized these acts operated through systematic linguistic alchemy. Population correction replaced mass execution. Atmospheric sterilization substituted for poisoning entire HAB blocks. Enhanced interrogation covered everything from psychological pressure to systematic torture. Morale recalibration became the official term for summary executions. This bureaucratic euphemism served a psychological function beyond mere administrative efficiency, creating moral distance that allowed agents to discuss atrocities without confronting their implications. Reports punished specificity and rewarded abstraction. A sentence reading 3 children perished was flagged for emotive framing. 3 unauthorized dependents neutralized under atmospheric sterilization passed without comment. Social isolation sealed the transformation. Security protocols kept heroes away from those they governed, surrounding them instead with peers who had made identical compromises. Vex now traveled in armored convoys, his interactions limited to subordinate officers and terrified civilians awaiting judgment. Caney's work kept him cloistered in secure facilities where subjects became data points rather than human faces. Thane's transhuman nature was reinforced by strategic coldness, his detachment from civilian populations complete. They lived inside professional atmospheres rich with incense and regulation, removed from the texture of ordinary despair, creating echo chambers where shared brutality became the standard of excellence. The system's most sophisticated control mechanism was the purity audit, quarterly assessments that measured loyalty through demonstrated willingness to inflict suffering when circumstances demanded it. These evaluations presented hypothetical scenarios requiring increasingly harsh responses, with passing grades dependent on active advocacy for escalated measures rather than mere acceptance of brutal necessity. The familiar 2.3% variance threshold appeared throughout these audits as the statistical trigger point where corrective measures became mandatory rather than optional. Vex's first audit after Kerek Prime staged a retreat scenario in a narrow corridor with foggers obscuring vision. An actor stumbled and begged while Auspex tracked heartbeat and cogitators timed response. Vex fired in 0.9 seconds, scoring exemplary marks. The candidate at the next station took 3 seconds and argued for detention pending inquiry, his variance exceeding tolerance. By dusk, he was on transport to a penal oversight billet. His career effectively ended. The lesson required no verbal instruction. One pause could be a lifetime. Caney's audit was quieter but equally decisive. The Ordo calculus presented a district with 2.29% morale variance, then added whispered vox silence to tip the threshold. He recommended precautionary catechesis for the first scenario, sterilization protocol, preparation for the second. The panel marked him for sensitivity to threshold dynamics and willingness to escalate when numbers warranted. A colleague who advocated extended observation at 2.51% received citation for statistical imprudence and reassignment to records. Thane's evaluation came as doctrinal exercise under the Reclusium's black vaults. Holoprojectors painted a manufactorum breach with refugees in maintenance tunnels, while pain surges bled through carapace interfaces. He chose containment over evacuation and recited the Catechism of the Blade, receiving a purity seal pressed to his pauldron. A brother who hesitated was given penances and orders for a Redemptor crusade. The 2.3% threshold extended beyond civilian monitoring into personnel evaluation systems. A commissar whose executions per quarter dropped beneath cohort averages drew observers. An acolyte whose escalation recommendations fell outside standard deviation received visits from internal affairs. An Astartes whose doctrinal responses slowed under controlled stress was scheduled for rigorous catechesis. Correction became therapy with teeth, deviation from expected brutality triggering institutional intervention. This feedback loop created perfect circular reinforcement. Heroes who performed brutal actions received rewards that isolated them from consequences while surrounding them with peers who normalized their choices. The language they used sanitized actions while evaluation systems demanded escalation. Social pressure prevented retreat while career advancement required continued progression down paths leading ever further from original moral frameworks. Each successful operation generated rewards requiring defense through subsequent operations, each promotion demanding proof of continued reliability through escalated brutality. Within months, Vex volunteered for inspection duties offering clean metrics. Caney requested oversight of variance analysis, yielding regular signatures. Thane petitioned for authority bands, expanding his discretion. Each had learned that the system rewarded appetite for necessary cruelty with advancement, recognition, and the intoxicating certainty that their actions served the greater good. The machine did not need to command monstrosity. It only needed to pay on time. Advancement confirmed what First Blood had suggested. Decisive cruelty was not the exception, but the job description. The abnormal became normal not through shouted orders but through whispers of approval and the cold grammar of forms. At day's end, new messages flickered green on 3 slates in 3 different rooms. Amber variants detected in Hive Hadrak. Advisory, preparatory measures recommended pending full assessment. The seals were not yet red, but the wax was warming. What happens when these external rewards become internal drives, when heroes begin to hunger for opportunities to prove their devotion through sanctified violence? How does institutional logic complete its transformation of personal psychology, turning servants of necessity into apostles of systematic cruelty, who measure righteousness by the mathematics of suffering inflicted? The ledgers climbed upward, but climbed upward. The rewards descended inward, settling into places the machine had not expected to reach. External validation began its alchemical work, transmuting duty into appetite, necessity into hunger. The heroes discovered something their conditioning had not prepared them for: the intoxicating sweetness of absolute moral authority. Power over life and death, when sanctified by institutional approval, produces an addiction more profound than any combat stimulant. The machine no longer needed to command, it only needed to provide opportunities. Commissar Vex began volunteering for execution duties that made other officers request reassignment. Morning rosters offered 3 paths: supply audits, training reviews, or disciplinary enforcement in the lower sectors. He consistently chose the third, drawn by what he rationalized as thoroughness but experienced as hunger. Walking the cramped corridors of worker habitations, he felt the rush of absolute authority over lives balanced on statistical edges. Each inspection became an opportunity to demonstrate zealous efficiency, a phrase that appeared with increasing frequency in his commendation files. He discovered infractions that previous inspectors had dismissed as minor variants: prayer attendance below optimal frequency, ration sharing that violated individual allocation protocols, work discussions extending beyond approved topics. Each violation offered a choice between administrative correction and disciplinary escalation. Vex increasingly chose escalation, finding profound satisfaction in the moment when realization dawned in civilian eyes, when they understood that small compromises with regulation had become capital offenses. The muzzle was a whisper's length from the visor. The litany of duty kept time between report and impact, not as absolution, but as metronome. He told a junior officer quietly that clean death was the only kindness the Imperium could afford. The phrase spread through the mess hall like doctrine. Interrogator Caney requested reassignment from analytical work to active interrogation operations, citing exceptional aptitude for what internal evaluations termed spiritual archaeology. His motivation had evolved beyond professional competence into religious fervor. Each session felt like prayer, each scream like hymnal response, each confession like absolution granted to both subject and interrogator. He developed techniques that transcended established protocols, innovations his reports described as enhanced spiritual refinement procedures. Traditional interrogation sought specific information through targeted pressure. Caney's methods aimed for complete psychological excavation, the systematic exposure of every doubt, every insufficient faith, every thought deviating from absolute loyalty. His subjects emerged not merely compliant but spiritually purified, their resistance burned away like foundry dross. The process transformed Caney as well. He began seeing himself not as interrogator, but as confessor, offering salvation through suffering to souls that might otherwise corrupt. Pain became prayer. Revelation became offering. The broken minds became sacrifices to the Emperor's infinite mercy. Captain Thane's transformation manifested as strategic innovation, proposals for preemptive action against populations showing early compromise indicators. His recommendations increasingly emphasized prevention over containment, surgical strikes over defensive measures. Why wait for heresy to manifest when statistical models could predict emergence with acceptable accuracy? His tactical assessments incorporated prophylactic sterilization protocols, recommendations for atmospheric correction in sectors showing variance patterns that historically preceded major outbreaks. The mathematics were compelling. Early intervention prevented exponential ideological contamination, small sacrifices prevented massive casualties, decisive action eliminated problems before they required resource-intensive solutions. Thane found deep satisfaction in these calculations, the godlike ability to foresee future suffering and prevent it through present necessity. Each proposal cited the Ash Angel as precedent for decisive subtraction, strategic mercy through surgical amputation. Each hero rationalized escalating appetite through theological frameworks that transformed cruelty into virtue. Pain became prayer offered on behalf of the suffering. Death became mercy, preventing greater corruption. Terror became education, teaching proper reverence for imperial authority. They developed personal liturgies that sanctified their work, private rituals, transforming operational procedures into worship. From these practices emerged the glass hymnal, a liturgy that began appearing in operational protocols across multiple departments. The verses praised clarity achieved through fire, purity through ash, mercy through decisive action. Vex hummed its refrains while reviewing execution lists. Caney recited its catechisms during interrogation sessions. Thane incorporated its battle prayers into tactical briefings. The hymnal spread through institutional channels, its anonymous authorship allowing each user to feel personal connection to its spiritual insights. Policy adjusted to accommodate appetite rather than constrain it. Advisory notices began authorizing preparatory measures below formal thresholds. The 2.3% variance line remained the official wall, but new doors opened at 1.8% and 2.0%, marked with phrases like prudent vigilance and anticipatory compliance. Zealous efficiency became a selection criterion for leadership cadres. Those advocating observation found themselves relegated to analysis posts. Those advocating preemption received authority over rooms where decisions lived. The psychological transformation completed when external validation became internal drive. Each hero measured righteousness by mathematics of suffering inflicted in service to the greater good. Each execution prevented rebellion. Each interrogation uncovered hidden corruption. Each sterilization preserved innocent lives from ideological contamination. The equations balanced perfectly in minds creating closed logical systems, justifying any action as necessary mercy. Amber warnings from Hive Hadrak deepened to yellow as surveillance detected patterns requiring enhanced monitoring. The situation demanded proven specialists whose zealous efficiency had been tested under fire. 3 names appeared on deployment rosters, their files speaking to unwavering dedication and innovative approaches to variance correction. How far can heroes fall while maintaining perfect self-righteousness, convinced that every atrocity serves divine purpose? What happens when the system's escalating demands begin to exceed even the boundaries of their corrupted consciences, when the machinery of sanctification requires actions that challenge their carefully constructed frameworks of necessary mercy? The machinery of sanctification had completed its fundamental work, but the weapons it created now demanded more than the system had intended to provide. External validation had become internal hunger, duty had transformed into appetite, and heroes who once followed brutal orders now actively sought opportunities to exceed them. The machine no longer needed to command monstrosity, it only needed to step aside and watch its creations interpret mandates with creative latitude that pushed every boundary beyond recognition. Commissar Vex submitted formal requests for permanent assignment to purity enforcement operations, citing statistical evidence that proactive intervention prevented cascade failures more efficiently than reactive measures. His personnel files documented a disturbing evolution. Where regulations required single-shot termination, Vex had developed ceremonial procedures involving extended recitation of the Litany of Duty, allowing condemned subjects time for proper penitence while crowds gathered to witness imperial justice. He called this innovation merciful preparation, arguing that public demonstration served educational purposes that strengthened community faith. His methods had transcended standard protocols entirely. An unfastened aquila became unauthorized alteration of sacred uniform. Whispered complaints about ration quality became economic sabotage designed to undermine morale. Workers who shared food with sick colleagues violated individual allocation protocols and demonstrated dangerous collectivist tendencies. Vex discovered he could stage loyalty tests that produced their own failures, order the morning hymn at double pace, then execute those who stumbled over unfamiliar cadences. His reports praised these innovations as comprehensive spiritual cleansing, noting that subsequent compliance ratings in areas under his oversight approached statistical impossibility. Interrogator Caney had evolved beyond traditional intelligence gathering into what his treatises termed spiritual refinements, systematic procedures that addressed not merely immediate security concerns, but the fundamental corruption of the human soul. His new methods required extended sessions lasting days rather than hours, complete psychological excavation that dismantled personality and rebuilt it according to approved templates. Where conventional interrogation sought specific answers, Caney's refinements pursued total spiritual reconstruction, the careful burning away of every thought that might eventually harbor heresy. His innovation lay in recognizing that surface compliance masked deeper pathology. True mercy required complete purification, the systematic elimination of dangerous individuality, and its replacement with proper reverence for imperial truth. His chambers filled with specialized cogitators measuring brainwave patterns and stress responses, ensuring maximum spiritual yield from each session. The process consumed considerable resources, but results justified investment. Zero recidivism among processed subjects, evidence that his spiritual refinements achieved permanent correction, where traditional methods offered only temporary compliance. Captain Thane had begun petitioning for unilateral purge authority, citing Ash Angel precedents and arguing that decisive action required freedom from bureaucratic delay. His tactical assessments increasingly emphasized preemptive purification, preventive measures that eliminated problems before they required extensive resource allocation. Historical records showed that the Ash Angels' most successful operations occurred when command structure granted complete tactical discretion, enabling immediate response to developing threats without consultation delays that allowed contamination to spread beyond containment parameters. The mathematics were unassailable. Early intervention prevented cascade failures requiring massive corrective actions. Small sacrifices prevented enormous casualties. Decisive leadership eliminated problems that committee oversight allowed to metastasize. Thane felt the voltage of expanded authority humming through his black carapace, promising that when equations demanded resolution, he would not need permission to choose ash over rot. These individual transformations found perfect convergence when surveillance networks detected troubling patterns in Hive Hadrak, a mid-tier industrial complex showing variance indicators that demanded comprehensive investigation. Initial reports documented seemingly minor deviations. Prayer attendance slightly below optimal levels, productivity metrics trending downward despite adequate supply allocation, unauthorized gatherings in maintenance sectors where workers shared childcare during double shifts. The auto-calculus processed incoming data streams and flagged the situation amber, then yellow as additional intelligence revealed coordinated resistance to recent policy adjustments. A water main fault had forced prayer processions to reroute through manufactorum alleys, registering as piety drift. Mutual aid ledgers among habwives mapped as unauthorized assemblies. Variance oscillated between 2.1 and 2.4%, dipping and rising in patterns that zealous efficiency interpreted as concealment behavior rather than random fluctuation. Red-sealed orders arrived simultaneously at 3 locations, bearing the weight of wax and the authority of the Carthage doctrine. The core text appeared in each packet, familiar phrases now carrying operational weight when containment cost threatens strategic continuity, sterilized to preserve. The authorization was comprehensive, granting discretionary authority over all aspects of variance correction up to and including complete atmospheric sterilization of compromised sectors. Operation Glass Hymnal received formal approval, with resource allocation sufficient for total population processing if circumstances demanded it. The operation name reflected the liturgical innovations that had emerged from successful variance corrections, the spiritual framework that transformed necessary cruelty into worship. Transport requisitions included atmospheric processors, containment barriers, and disposal assets calibrated to hive-scale operations. In Hive Hadrak, morning prayers rose through ventilation systems while transport ships entered orbital approach, carrying heroes whose devotion had transformed them into instruments of systematic annihilation. The civilian population continued daily routines, unaware that their small deviations from perfect compliance had triggered responses calibrated to their complete elimination. A major operation loomed where heroes would face their ultimate test, their appetite for sanctified violence meeting unlimited authority over an entire population whose fate had already been sealed by thresholds crossed and doctrines invoked. Hive Hadrak woke to a new weather. Containment protocols engaged with bureaucratic precision as blast barriers rose from concealed positions and atmospheric processors reversed their ancient rhythm, exhaling sweet antiseptic mist where they had once inhaled the hive's rank breath. The vapor rolled like ground fog through 17 levels of corridors and hab blocks, smelling of incense cut with solvents. Chapel and laboratory mated into something that promised healing while hinting at flammable intent. Voxcasters replaced morning work schedules with liturgy as the glass hymnal droned through the network, its refrains riding the city like weather, mercy through fire, purity through ash, preservation through pain. The Order's militant advanced in paired files through the thickening mist, their white armor softened by condensation, bolt guns canted low in practiced readiness. Above them, servo skulls projected hymnal verses onto perspiring stone, while the processor's blades blurred to invisible, the hive's lungs humming. Mechanical pentameter. Citizens emerged for mandatory morning prayers and found themselves directed through screening stations where loyalty indices were measured through biometric analysis and stress response monitoring. Commissar Vex established Population Processing Station Alpha in the central plaza, where morning assemblies provided convenient sorting opportunities. His innovation lay in making compliance verification feel administrative rather than punitive, allowing subjects to maintain dignity while systems determined their fate. Citizens passed through scanner arrays measuring micro-expressions and autonomic responses to loyalty oath recitation. Those registering within acceptable parameters received green wristbands and relocation to upper sector holding areas. Those exceeding variance thresholds received red tags and transfer to enhanced verification facilities. A child clutched a tin saint while his mother answered questions about prayer frequency and workplace conversations, the stamped metal worn smooth where small thumbs had worried its surface. The scanner detected elevated stress but registered it as family concern rather than ideological deviation. Green band, next station. Behind them, a woman hammered sealed doors until knuckles split while others applauded from rear ranks, chanting, "Mercy is fire with tears bright and fervent," taught that burning was benediction. Interrogator Caney converted administratum offices into compliance verification centers, where red-tagged subjects underwent rapid spiritual assessment. His chambers filled with the sound of prayers and confessions as processing quotas demanded efficiency over precision, leading to innovations that accelerated spiritual archaeology through concentrated application of his refined techniques. The glass hymnal provided musical accompaniment while cogitators measured screams against intelligence value, each session contributing to the hive's systematic purification. Captain Thane directed structural cleansing operations from a command post overlooking the primary ventilation systems, his tactical assessment identifying 11 sectors requiring atmospheric correction based on surveillance data and population density calculations. Sororitas columns maintained choke points as atmospheric processors completed their work, filling designated areas with vapor that citizens initially mistook for sanctification incense. The mathematics were elegant: reverse flow concentrated purity agents in high variance areas while preserving essential personnel in upper reaches. The decisive moment arrived when final variance calculations remained inconclusive. Holographic displays showed readings oscillating between 2.1 and 2.6% across different sectors, statistical noise that fell within operational margins but exceeded absolute certainty thresholds. The Ordo calculus processed available intelligence and returned probability matrices rather than definitive threat assessments, uncertainty beating like a heart through the data streams. The command arrived with the quiet authority of legend made manifest. He stepped into the operations gallery with no escort but reputation, armor the color of ash after rain, wings painted not on his back but in the mind of anyone who had learned the catechisms. The Ash Angel looked at variance maps, not faces, at atmospheric readings, not pleas. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of doctrine made flesh. When containment cost threatened strategic continuity, sterilized to preserve. The percentages were immaterial. Risk of cascade failure across the sector required decisive action regardless of uncertainty. Doors hold, fire walks. The command was absolute. Atmospheric processors completed their reversal as blast barriers sealed with mechanical finality. The purity vapor revealed its true nature as respiratory systems began failing in lower sectors. A sister's trigger finger trembled at a maintenance access before training steadied the tremor. These were not people but problems, not faces, but variant statistics requiring correction. Ignition points flared across designated levels, controlled conflagration, feeding on the hive's own systems, while the glass hymnal reached fever pitch, a chorus of righteous absolution. The operation proceeded with textbook precision. Every protocol followed, every authorization documented, every casualty recorded in appropriate ledgers. Audit trails captured perfect compliance with established procedures and proper chain of command authorization. Time stamps marched down data slates, seal integrity confirmed, variance spikes corrected, population processing completed, structural cleansing authorized. By evening, 17 sectors processed, variance eliminated, mission objectives achieved with zero deviation from approved procedures. When processors throttled down, ash drifted through ventilation systems like snow, settling in boot seams and collecting on a tin saint melted to featureless metal. Silence took the hive in both hands, profound and absolute, silence like judgment rendered and recorded. 3 heroes reviewed preliminary estimates and felt warm satisfaction of professional competence, validated through successful execution. Their innovations had contributed to operational efficiency, while their devotion ensured proper spiritual framework for necessary actions. The ledgers registered textbook execution with perfect documentation ascending through command hierarchies. But what does the post-operation audit reveal when forensic analysis examines actual threat levels against projected risks? How do heroes process the inevitable gap between doctrine's mathematical certainty and reality's accounting, between the promises of necessary mercy and the arithmetic of ash that will not wash from their gloves. The ash had only just settled when the accounting began. Administratum auditors, sororitas archivists and lex mechanics fanned through the deserted corridors of Hive Hadrak, their presence as ritualized as the purge itself. Scribe skulls floated in silent procession, cataloguing bone fragments and scanning for chemical traces in vents. The machinery that had orchestrated the operation now set to work measuring its harvest, translating suffering into figures and silence into compliance metrics. The forensic audit cut through the lingering incense and residual fear with the precision of a scalpel. Of the 11 hive sectors subjected to full atmospheric correction, only one revealed credible evidence of chaos: a hidden shrine, some scarification, and a handful of intercepted heretical liturgies. The rest, Sector 3's unauthorized gatherings, Sector 9's lapsed prayer attendance, Sector 12's productivity decline, were traced not to sedition, but to the pressures of daily survival: mothers sharing childcare, broken chronometers, malnutrition from failed rations. What the Ordo calculus had flagged as variance was, in most cases, the desperate coping of a population brutalized by earlier compliance operations. Trauma left vigilance, and vigilance looked like concealment to the machine. Yet the official audit did not permit the language of regret or error. Its grammar was that of victory, stamped, signed, and sealed by 17 oversight bodies. The summary declared decisive action prevented escalation, comprehensive variance correction ensured sector-wide stability and preserved strategic continuity. The report made no distinction between the one infected sector and the 10 merely scarred by fear. All were recorded as threats eliminated, their erasure proof of strategic foresight. The audit cited the precedent of the Ash Angel, whose doctrine, better to cauterize broadly than let infection fester, was now enshrined in procedural scripture. Commendations followed with bureaucratic efficiency. Vex was elevated to senior commissar, his innovations in population sorting lauded as best practice, and his jurisdiction expanded across multiple regimental groups. Caney's spiritual refinement methods were officially adopted, and he received full interrogator status, granted access to deeper archives, and a mandate to propagate his approach. Thane's tactical precision was rewarded with limited inquisitorial authority for rapid containment, a legal fiction that gave an Astartes the latitude to act before committees could intervene. The Ash Angel became not just a legend, but a recruitment icon, his flame-wreathed silhouette now emblazoned on posters and training materials, promising that decisive mercy would preserve tomorrow. But the ledgers carried a secret not meant for posters. Astropathic logs, reviewed as a minor addendum, noted a measurable rise in warp resonance sector-wide. At the hour, the processes reversed. A keening background note, a subtle uptick in distress harmonics. The despair manufactured at scale had a destination. The operation meant to cauterize infection had instead sown the seeds of future corruption, feeding the very warp it was designed to starve. Survivors, stripped of hope and haunted by the memory of systematic annihilation, became more vulnerable to the predations of chaos, not less. The system, however, was calibrated to reward severity, not necessity. The audit templates measured compliance arcs and found them perfect. Procedures had been followed, authorizations were in order, and the documentation was immaculate. The scale of the response became its own justification. The risk had been serious because the answer was vast. Severity was both the outcome and the evidence, each operation a case study for the next. The heroes, for their part, processed their elevation as they had processed the operation itself, through the lens of doctrine and data. Vex recited his new oath, believing that public, exemplary death would educate the living and stave off future calamity. Caney saw the resonance graphs as confirmation that pain was prayer, and that the sacrifice had meaning. Thane found vindication in the single confirmed vector, underlining it in his report as proof that the broad cut had been justified. Each man's doubts, if any remained, were buried beneath a tide of signatures and seals. The machinery of righteousness, now self-perpetuating, learned to find again what it had taught itself to see. Advisory thresholds were quietly adjusted downward. What once warranted caution now demanded action. Each purge generated the conditions for the next. Each reward demanded escalation. Each success became a template for further suffering. In the plaza, maintenance crews swept away ash while above. The Ash Angel's eyes watched from propaganda posters. The caption promised that decisive mercy had preserved the future, even as the cycle began anew. In the end, the system's ledgers spoke louder than the voices of the lost. The heroes had built their success on foundations that, in truth, had only deepened the shadow. The machinery, satisfied by its own reflection, prepared to move again, its appetite whetted by the very suffering it claimed to end. The commendations from Hive Hadrak marked not an end, but a metamorphosis, the moment when external validation completed its alchemical work and transformed duty into hunger, necessity into appetite. The heroes no longer required orders to seek opportunities for sanctified violence. They had become self-generating engines of systematic cruelty, their monstrosity perfected by success and sanctified by institutional approval. The machine had taught them what righteousness looked like, then stepped aside to watch them exceed every expectation. Senior Commissar Vex developed what he termed merciful translations, ceremonial procedures that elevated standard executions into spiritual theater. His innovation lay in recognizing that death could serve educational purposes beyond mere elimination of dissent, that each bolt round could become a sermon and every execution a sacrament. He requisitioned elevated platforms for optimal visibility, amplification systems for proper liturgical audibility, and incense dispensers to sanctify the proceedings with the sweet smoke of purification. His new protocols required public squares and mandatory attendance, transforming executions into community events where citizens learned to applaud the moment of impact as evidence of the Emperor's infinite compassion. Vex crafted personal liturgies for each condemned subject, tailored confessions that explained how their deaths served the greater good. A worker executed for productivity variance became a cautionary tale about the spiritual dangers of sloth. A mother shot for unauthorized resource sharing demonstrated the corrupting influence of misplaced charity. Each merciful translation reinforced the lesson that individual suffering was prayer offered on behalf of collective salvation. He found profound satisfaction in watching comprehension dawn in civilian faces the moment when they understood that witnessing sanctified death was itself an act of worship. His efficiency ratings soared as compliance in territories under his oversight approached statistical impossibility. Entire populations transformed into congregations of grateful terror. The phrase spread through his jurisdiction like doctrine, translation, not execution. Vex felt gentled by the word even as his clearance quotas rose and his men competed for precision in both marksmanship and liturgical cadence. Interrogator Caney had begun composing treatises on spiritual archaeology, systematic documentation of his enhanced interrogation methodologies that elevated information extraction from crude torture to sublime art. His writings described the human soul as a corrupted archive requiring careful excavation, layer by layer, until pure loyalty emerged from beneath the accumulated sediment of doubt and self-interest. Traditional interrogation, he argued, addressed symptoms while his spiritual refinements treated the underlying pathology of insufficient devotion. His monographs circulated through inquisitorial archives as breakthrough scholarship, revolutionary approaches to the ancient problem of heretical thought. Caney had discovered that pain was merely the entry point to deeper transformation, that properly applied suffering could burn away everything that made resistance possible. His chambers became surgical theatres for the soul, where subject screams were not signs of suffering, but the necessary friction of spiritual rebirth. The process required considerable time and resources, but results justified investment. Zero recidivism among processed subjects, complete ideological conversion, living proof that the human soul could be perfected through systematic application of necessary cruelty. Captain Thane petitioned for expanded planetary sterilization authority, citing Hive Hadrak as proof of concept for strategic-scale purification operations. His tactical assessments incorporated prophylactic measures that eliminated problems before they required extensive resource allocation, preemptive strikes against populations showing early indicators of ideological compromise. Why wait for a world to fester with 2.3% variance when atmospheric correction could prevent decades of potential contamination? His proposals outlined scenarios where immediate systematic sterilization of entire populations based on early risk assessment would save billions of lives by eliminating sources of galactic infection. The mathematics were compelling. Early intervention prevented cascade failures, small sacrifices prevented enormous casualties, decisive leadership eliminated threats that committee oversight allowed to metastasize into sector-wide catastrophes. Thane felt the weight of expanded authority like a sacrament, the promise that when equations demanded resolution, he would possess the discretion to act without bureaucratic delay. His requisitions included orbital bombardment platforms and atmospheric processing ships, tools calibrated to world-scale operations where his tactical innovations could prevent the kind of widespread corruption that required multiple system responses. The system formalized their escalating brutality through the ultimate validation, canonization of their inspiration. The Ash Angel was formally enshrined in ecclesiarchy texts as he who chose Ash over Rot, his doctrine elevated from tactical precedent to theological scripture. His image appeared not merely on recruitment materials but in chapel windows and prayer cards, a winged figure stepping through flame with the inscription that decisive mercy preserves tomorrow. Seminary students studied his campaigns as masterworks of strategic necessity, learning to calculate acceptable losses and measure individual tragedy against collective survival. This canonization provided theological framework for systematic cruelty, official validation that violence in service of the greater good was not merely permissible but sacred. Priests delivered sermons praising his willingness to bear the burden of necessary decisions, to sacrifice his own comfort for the salvation of others. The saint of hard choices became patron of difficult mathematics invoked whenever doctrine demanded actions that challenged conventional morality. Zealous efficiency became a tracked indicator, with units showing higher translation rates, receiving better rations, newer equipment, and preferred assignments. The system had succeeded in creating perfect monsters who genuinely believed themselves righteous servants of divine will. They were not driven by malice or personal gain, nor corrupted by the insidious whispers of chaos. Instead, they operated from unshakable conviction that every act of calculated cruelty served the Emperor's will and humanity's survival. They had achieved complete psychological transformation, their humanity systematically excised and replaced with unyielding devotion to abstract ideals measured in acceptable loss, mathematics, and purification statistics. This made them more dangerous than any chaos-corrupted enemy. Where chaos offered corruption through temptation and excess, these imperial saints had achieved corruption through duty and necessity, their monstrosity sanctified by audit trails and blessed by bureaucratic approval. They operated with institutional legitimacy, absolute moral certainty, and bureaucratic efficiency that even demonic forces could not match. They were self-sustaining engines of systematic violence, driven by genuine faith rather than dark compulsion, making their cruelty both unlimited and unquestionable within the system that created them. In maintenance corridors and worker dormitories, the cost tallied itself in smaller ledgers. Citizens learned to applaud at executions while counting the hours mandatory attendance took from sleep. A girl held ration tins like relics while ash from atmospheric correction settled on abandoned doors. The spiral had completed its turn, creating servants whose devotion exceeded all reasonable bounds, who actively sought opportunities to demonstrate their purity of purpose through innovations that pushed every boundary of acceptable cruelty. What distinguishes these imperial monsters from the enemies they claim to fight, when their methods, scale, and human cost prove functionally identical to the forces of chaos? How does the Imperium manage its own created horrors when the weapons it forged begin to exceed even the boundaries of institutional tolerance, becoming threats to the very system that sanctified their transformation? The mirror the Imperium holds to chaos reflects with perfect clarity, polished by ash and sanctified by audit trails. On one side stand gods promising appetite without limit, ecstasies of rage and change and decay. On the other, saints of hard arithmetic, administrators of survival, surgeons wielding flame like scalpel. Their banners differ, their prayers invoke different names, but when the work reaches human skin, the distinction collapses into shared methodology. Terror calibrates behavior, mass graves balance ledgers. The mathematics of systematic cruelty remain identical regardless of the ideology that sanctifies them. Senior Commissar Vex discovered this disturbing symmetry during compliance operations on Mordian 7, where word-bearer cultists had established execution quotas and public demonstration protocols that differed from his merciful translations only in iconography. Where his ceremonies invoked the Emperor's infinite compassion, their blood offerings praised the dark god's eternal hunger. Both systems operated through witnessed suffering that transformed spectators into accomplices. Both measured success through community compliance achieved via calculated brutality. Both maintained ideological purity through regular elimination of the insufficiently devoted. The captured apostle, when processed through Cain's spiritual refinements, examined imperial execution records with professional admiration, noting the elegant efficiency of loyalty verification systems and the psychological sophistication of mandatory attendance protocols. Interrogator Caney's enhanced interrogation of chaos cultists on Vaxhall Prime revealed psychological frameworks functionally identical to his own spiritual archaeology techniques. Both systems destroyed individual identity and rebuilt personality according to approved templates. Both transformed suffering into sacrament, resistance into proof of insufficient faith requiring further correction. Both measured success through complete elimination of independent thought. The cultists described their conversion process in terms that mirrored Caney's own refinements. Systematic pressure, until psychological resistance collapsed, careful excavation of buried loyalties, methodical replacement of personal will with absolute devotion to abstract ideals. Caney found himself incorporating chaos innovations into his own procedures, improving efficiency ratings while maintaining proper theological framework through imperial iconography. Captain Thane's encounter with a fallen Imperial fist on Tertius Station provided the most chilling validation. The Chaos Marine studied Thane's preemptive sterilization protocols with professional respect, praising their superior efficiency compared to traditional corruption methods that required extended warp exposure to achieve comparable population elimination. The heretic observed that Imperial systematic cruelty accomplished results through proper procedure, that chaos forces could match only through demonic intervention, making Imperial methodology more reliable and scalable than supernatural corruption. During the final engagement, as atmospheric processes reversed and purity vapor flooded the station's lower levels, the fallen Astartes made an observation that haunted subsequent reports. "You burn worlds in the name of order while we burn them in the name of change, but the worlds burn the same. The only difference is that we admit what we are." This comparison revealed the horrifying operational truth. In methods, scale, and human cost, there was no meaningful difference between Imperial heroes and their Chaos counterparts. Both operated through terror, mass slaughter, and absolute devotion to ideology. Both converted individual suffering into collective salvation through theological frameworks that sanctified systematic cruelty as service to higher powers. Both measured righteousness through body counts and compliance statistics, transforming human lives into data points in equations that always resolved in favor of necessary violence. The key distinction lay not in methodology but in psychological framework. Chaos offered corruption through temptation and excess, promising power and freedom from moral restraint. Converts chose damnation with full knowledge, embracing transformation into monsters through conscious rebellion against conventional morality. Imperial corruption operated through duty and necessity, offering salvation through service and righteousness through sacrifice. Heroes were transformed into monsters while maintaining absolute conviction that every calculated cruelty served divine will and humanity's survival. This made Imperial heroes more dangerous than their Chaos counterparts in every measurable dimension. Chaos Marines operated as individuals or small warbands, their effectiveness limited by internal competition and the inherently chaotic nature of their patron powers. Imperial heroes operated with institutional support, unlimited resources, and bureaucratic efficiency that multiplied individual brutality into systematic horror spanning entire sectors. Where chaos corruption required supernatural intervention to achieve planetary-scale atrocities, Imperial doctrine accomplished identical results through proper procedure and adequate paperwork. Most critically, Imperial heroes operated from unshakable moral certainty that immunized them against doubt or hesitation. Chaos Marines knew themselves damned and found strength in embracing their fall from grace. Imperial saints believed themselves righteous servants of divine will, their conviction absolute and consciences clear. They could authorize atmospheric sterilization of entire populations while feeling genuine spiritual satisfaction, measure righteousness by mathematics of suffering inflicted, and sleep peacefully, knowing every scream served the greater good. Combat reports documented encounters where Imperial forces shocked, even hardened, Chaos Marines with their systematic approach to civilian elimination. A Death Guard detachment, accustomed to Nurgle's slow decay, observed Space Marines implementing sanitation protocols with such methodical, dispassionate efficiency that the Chaos forces found the purity of destruction more alien than their own festering devotion. The cold, analytical brutality of Imperial extermination, devoid of passion or excess, proved more horrifying than the most elaborate ritualistic sacrifice. The system had succeeded in creating monsters worse than chaos because they believed themselves heroes. Their systematic cruelty was sanctified by audit trails, blessed by bureaucratic approval, validated by institutional reward structures that made every atrocity profitable. They were self-sustaining engines of violence driven by genuine faith rather than dark compulsion, making their brutality both unlimited and unquestionable within the framework that created them. The mirror reflected perfectly, two systems achieving identical results through opposite philosophical approaches, both measuring success through efficient conversion of human lives into strategic objectives. The only meaningful difference was that one side admitted what they had become, while the other maintained the fiction of righteousness through careful management of language and institutional validation. How does the Imperium maintain this fiction of righteousness when evidence of equivalence becomes impossible to ignore? What happens to those heroes who begin recognizing themselves in the mirror, who see their methodology reflected in the enemies they claim to fight, and realize their transformation into monsters was not corruption, but the system's most perfect success? The mirror wrapped itself in sacred cloth and found sanctuary behind altars, where incense masked the scent of ash. When heroes began recognizing themselves in the methodologies of their enemies, when the operational symmetry became impossible to ignore, the machinery of denial activated with the same systematic precision that had forged the monsters in the first place. The Imperium understood that its greatest weapons required maintenance not merely of equipment but of conscience, that self-reflection was a luxury efficient instruments could not afford. Propaganda transformed every atrocity into victory through industrial-scale linguistic alchemy. Hive Hadrak's 17 sectors became a triumph of preemptive action that preserved millions from corruption. Official reports emphasized the single confirmed chaos vector, while omitting the 10 sectors purged without credible threat, painting surgical precision against overwhelming odds. Bodies became compliance arcs, screams became ambient noise beneath vox choirs, and atmospheric sterilization replaced mass murder in every document that climbed the bureaucratic hierarchy. Administratum clerks learned to replace names with asset tags, then delete the tags after audit, ensuring that heroes encountered only abstractions that supported their righteousness. Ritual sanctification ceremonies provided the psychological architecture for sustained denial. Senior Commissar Vex knelt monthly before altars where his execution statistics were read as litanies of mercy, each terminated subject transformed into prayer offered for those who remained. The confessor painted ash sigils on his gloves while intoning that translation, not execution, carried souls across necessary thresholds. Interrogator Caney received blessings at the basin of remedies where officiants wiped his instruments with perfumed cloth and praised pain delivered through loyal hands as prayer made manifest. Captain Thane returned to the Reclusium for cleansing rituals that nailed purity parchments to his pauldron, the chaplain calling sealed doors shields held in positions that mattered. These ceremonies served dual functions, cleansing participants while reinforcing their special status as chosen instruments bearing burdens ordinary souls could not endure. The system weaponized conscience itself, converting moral distress into validation rather than warning. Heroes who felt sick after atmospheric corrections were praised for spiritual sensitivity. Those who lost sleep after sterilization operations received commendations for dedication despite personal cost. The machinery taught them that monsters felt nothing while heroes suffered for necessary choices, making psychological anguish proof of virtue rather than evidence of corruption. Purity audits measured this suffering with clinical precision, the familiar 2.3% threshold returning as variance in hesitation responses. Officers whose execution rates dropped below cohort averages drew observers. Acolytes, whose escalation recommendations fell outside statistical norms, received visits from internal affairs. Response times exceeding parameters triggered enhanced catechesis designed to restore proper devotional focus. Moral awakening was punished as heresy's first symptom. A junior sister who hesitated at a Hab shrine was offered repentia, strip the armor, carry the eviscerator, bleed until ledgers balanced. A munitorum clerk who annotated casualty reports with names instead of numbers was transferred to penal logistics where numbers ended quickly. An acolyte suggesting prolonged observation for borderline variants disappeared into internal affairs chaplaincy for doctrinal alignment. The system tolerated brutality but could not tolerate self-reflection that might expose the foundational lie. New recruits learned from sanctified monsters who genuinely believed themselves pure servants of divine will. Training programs incorporated Hadrak and similar operations as tactical masterpieces worthy of emulation. Young commissars studied Vex's merciful translations as innovations in morale management. Acolytes analyzed Caney's spiritual refinements as breakthrough purification methodology. Neophytes memorized Thane's preemptive protocols as strategic foresight, preventing larger catastrophes. Each generation inherited refined techniques, while remaining insulated from evidence that might challenge their righteousness, the cycle perpetuating through institutional memory that preserved methodology while erasing context. The machinery of denial felt pastoral because it was. It crooned that burdens were shared, sins were washed, and the Emperor knew his own. It stamped and sealed and sang until heroes could stand in quiet rooms, remember doors they had ordered sealed on thousands of throats, and call the memory sacrament. The mirror remained wrapped, and the cloth smelled of incense and solvent, sweet with the promise that necessary cruelty was holy work. But what fate awaits those rare heroes who break through the denial, despite every safeguard, who recognize their transformation and refuse the comfort of sanctified self-deception? How does the system eliminate internal threats to its mythology when the weapons it created begin questioning the hands that forged them? The machinery of denial functioned with perfect efficiency until it encountered the one variable it could not process: genuine moral awakening in the weapons it had created. When cracks appeared in the sanctified delusions that insulated heroes from their own monstrosity, the system responded with the same systematic precision that had forged them, but now applied in reverse. The tragic irony was complete. Those expressing moral qualms were eliminated not by external enemies, but by former comrades who viewed moral awakening as corruption requiring immediate correction. Senior Commissar Vex experienced his moment of clarity during a routine execution detail on Mordian 7, where 17 civilians awaited translation for productivity variants. As he raised his bolt pistol toward the first subject, a young man clutching a worn data slate displaying a family photo, something fractured in the psychological architecture that had sustained his righteousness. The mirror unwrapped itself suddenly, violently, showing him not a servant of mercy, but a monster whose efficiency had been purchased through systematic brutality against innocents, whose only crime was being human in an inhuman system. Ash falling like snow on a tin saint, a child's thumb-worn metal soft under soot. The memories surfaced uninvited, and with them came recognition. He lowered his weapon and spoke the words that sealed his fate. This man's variance is within acceptable parameters for re-education, not translation. The silence that followed carried the weight of institutional collapse. His replacement, Commissar Yarrick, a graduate of the same scholar, trained in Vex's own methods, stepped forward with fluid precision. Senior Commissar, your variance is 3.7%. Commissariat Continuity Protocol 17B requires immediate correction. 2 shots to center mass, 1 to the head, exactly as taught. The reports noted successful completion of morale correction operations and elimination of a commissar showing dangerous deviation in loyalty assessment protocols. Interrogator Caney's awakening came more gradually, a slow erosion of certainty as he processed subject after subject and found no correlation between their confessions and actual threats to Imperial security. During a session with a suspected cult leader, a woman who had merely organized unsanctioned prayer vigils for her dying community, Caney broke her mind and found nothing but desperate, pure faith in the Emperor's mercy. The Ordo calculus had flagged her at 2.8% variance, but for the first time, Caney questioned the necessity. "She is clean," he stated to his acolyte. "Further processing will yield no new data." The acolyte, trained in Caney's own refined techniques, looked at him with clinical disappointment. "Master, your variance in judgment is 4.1%. Such deviation indicates potential contamination of analytical objectivity." Within hours, Caney found himself not in his interrogation chamber, but in one just like it, facing an acolyte from internal affairs. His own tools, his own techniques, were turned against him. He disappeared into inquisitorial custody, his name purged from active rosters, his treatises re-edited to remove all mention of his fate, a cautionary tale of brilliant minds succumbing to statistical imprudence. Captain Thane alone survived his moment of recognition by grinding the mirror to powder. When evidence suggested his preemptive sterilization protocols were creating the despair that fed chaos rather than preventing it, when astropathic readings showed warp resonance spiking after each atmospheric correction, he faced the same choice as his fallen comrades. Instead of questioning the system, he questioned his own resolve, interpreting doubt as weakness requiring correction through decisive action. On a supply-failing moon flagged at 2.5% variance, he authorized complete atmospheric correction, citing the Carthage Doctrine and Ash Angel precedent. 3 million civilians reduced to ash, their statistical variance eliminated. Thane's report concluded, containment cost minimized, strategic continuity preserved, variance reduced to 0.0%. His actions were praised, as zealous efficiency exemplified. The system had created a perfect trap that made redemption impossible while rewarding continued descent into monstrosity. Heroes who recognized their transformation were eliminated by the very machinery that created them, while those who doubled down on brutality received commendations and expanded authority. The institutional logic was flawless. Moral awakening threatened operational efficiency, making conscience itself a form of corruption requiring immediate correction. The Imperium had become a chaos cult worshipping order instead of change, producing identical results through opposite philosophical means. Where chaos offered corruption through temptation, the imperial system achieved corruption through duty, but both eliminated dissent through systematic violence and measured success through body counts. The only difference was that chaos admitted its nature, while the Imperium maintained the fiction of righteousness through careful management of language and institutional memory. New heroes replaced the fallen, trained by survivors who had learned the correct lessons. The system incorporated each failure as validation of its necessity, proof that even dedicated servants could fall without proper vigilance. Training programs emphasized Vex and Caney as cautionary tales about insufficient faith, while Thane's survival demonstrated that absolute dedication could overcome any doubt. The cycle perpetuated itself through institutional learning that preserved methodology while erasing context, ensuring that only the most perfectly corrupted survived to train the next generation. How does this cycle ensure its own perpetuation when the weapons it creates become indistinguishable from the enemies they fight? What is the ultimate accounting of this system's true cost when the cure has become identical to the disease, when the guardians have transformed into the very threats they were created to eliminate? The cycle completed itself in silence, not with the thunder of orbital bombardment or the screams of dying worlds, but with the whisper of stylus on parchment and the mechanical hum of atmospheric processes cycling through their daily maintenance routine. The transformation was complete. Heroes had become monsters, emergency had become procedure, and the Imperium's salvation had revealed itself as systematic self-consumption wrapped in the liturgy of necessary mercy. Survival had demanded a new shape for virtue, and it had become a checklist, stamped and filed, capable of moving without conscience, through halls that still smelled of solvent and incense. The Carthage doctrine, conceived during the darkest hours of the Horus heresy as desperate protocol for impossible choices, had calcified into peacetime standard procedure. What began as wartime necessity, when containment cost threatened strategic continuity, sterilized to preserve, now appeared on daily operational orders signed by clerks who had never seen the battlefields that birthed it. The original authors were dead, their names erased from institutional memory, their desperate marginalia warning if and only in extremis deleted from successive revisions. The red-sealed urgency had faded to routine administrative approval, emergency authorization transformed into standing operational doctrine. What remained was pure procedure. Thresholds replaced judgment, the 2.3% variance line triggering automatic responses with mathematical certainty. Awards replaced grief as the system's response to mass casualties. Efficiency metrics replaced humanity in every evaluation that climbed the bureaucratic hierarchy. The machine had achieved perfect operational efficiency by systematically eliminating the friction of conscience. Economic consequences spread through the Imperium supply networks like infection through arterial systems. Sterilized worlds broke production chains that fed other worlds, creating what administrative reports termed sanitation debt, a condition where the only remaining resource was people to be processed. A planet purged for 2.3% variance in tithe compliance meant neighboring systems experienced supply deficits that triggered their own variance investigations. The mathematics were inexorable. Shortage became deviation. Deviation demanded correction. Correction created further shortage. Agricultural worlds purged for productivity. Variance created food shortages that sparked civil unrest on hive worlds, which were then sterilized for public order failures, creating refugee populations that overwhelmed neighboring systems, which were purged for resource allocation breakdown. Scarcity had learned to behave like contagion because policy taught it how, each solution creating problems that demanded identical solutions. Citizens internalized the machinery's lessons with the thoroughness of the truly terrorized. They learned to applaud at executions, chant the glass hymnal during atmospheric corrections, and report neighbors for statistical deviations, not from malice but from desperate understanding that such performances were the only path to temporary safety. Children grew up knowing that love was variance, sharing was resource misallocation, and questioning was heresy requiring immediate correction. The manufactured despair became a fertile breeding ground for the very chaos the system fought. Every scream from sealed hab blocks, every tear shed in silent terror, every fragment of hope systematically destroyed fed the entities of the warp with industrial efficiency. The Imperium had transformed itself into the galaxy's most productive despair manufacturing facility, its atmospheric corrections and purity vapors generating psychic screams that nourished demonic entities across the sector. Astropathic readings revealed the horrifying truth that audit reports buried a statistical anomaly. Warp resonance spiked after every successful purge operation. Measures designed to starve the Imperium were fertilizing it with systematic suffering. Every sterilization created trauma that resonated through the warp. Every purge generated the psychic sustenance that allowed chaos to flourish. The cure had become indistinguishable from the disease, the treatment more toxic than the pathology it claimed to address. The Ordo Calculus noted these correlations, then redacted them when they threatened procurement for subsequent operations. A closed loop protected itself. Every purge generated warp activity that justified further purges. Every sterilization created the desperation that manifested as heretical behavior requiring sterilization. The Ash Angel transcended history to become sacred legend, his image appearing on recruitment materials and chapel windows across the Imperium. New heroes learned his catechism, Better ash than rot, better fire than infection, and carried his example into operations where they discovered the intoxicating clarity of absolute moral authority. His canonization as he who chose ash over rot provided theological framework for unlimited brutality, transforming tactical precedent into divine mandate. Training programs incorporated Hadrak and similar operations as masterpieces worthy of emulation. Each generation inherited refined techniques while remaining insulated from evidence that might challenge their righteousness. The cycle perpetuated through institutional learning that preserved methodology while erasing context, ensuring that only the most perfectly corrupted survived to train their replacements. In the ruins of Hive Hadrak, the ceremony chamber stood empty, its cracked tiles and faded red line testimony to efficiency achieved. The metal-pinned rebreather hung from a maintenance hook, its brass disc tarnished but readable. Below it, a notice bore the Departamento Munitorum seal and a single line: sanitation achieved. The chamber's occupant had been processed according to established protocols, his gratitude recorded in ledgers that climbed toward archives where clerks converted individual tragedy into statistical validation. The quiet monster had revealed itself not as aberration, but as maintenance, not as corruption, but as core function. The Imperium had created a system that transformed its most idealistic servants into instruments of systematic annihilation while maintaining their absolute conviction that every atrocity served divine will. Heroes became monsters not through temptation or rebellion, but through perfect compliance with institutional logic, their transformation measured in commendations rather than corruption. The machine hummed on, processing variance into compliance, converting lives into statistics, transforming human suffering into the raw material of galactic stability. In the grim darkness of the far future, monstrosity is not aberration, but maintenance, and the most dangerous enemies are those who believe themselves righteous while wielding the mathematics of necessary mercy